In April 1917, US Congress and Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany, officially entering America into World War I. The war declaration came after years of America providing economic and military assistance to Britain and France. The decision of America to intervene in World War I would have profoundly negative impacts on the world and on America. And it's far worse than you thought. America today is a world-spanning empire with military bases on every continent. The dominant ideology in the American government is that America should be the world police, intervening around the world to spread democracy and enforce its interests. This ideology has its origin in World War I. The Second World War gets much more attention in American history, but it wouldn't have happened without the First World War. World War I began in 1914 and featured the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, clashing with the Entente, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. In 1917, the US also joined the war on the side of the Entente. American intervention, both military and economic, played an essential role in the downfall of the Central Powers. Today, it's widely agreed on that Germany would have been victorious had America stayed neutral. But what many don't know today is that American intervention in the war actually made it much bigger and deadlier than it needed to be. And by securing the Entente's victory, America directly paved the way for another world war. In this video, I'll be showing why America should not have joined World War I. This video is sponsored by Shortform. As someone who loves history, I'm always looking for good books to help me improve my knowledge. Shortform is a website that provides the world's best guides to nonfiction books. It gives detailed book summaries, covering all the work's key ideas and connecting them to similar works. One book I've been using Shortform to study lately is On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Shortform gives a summary that helps me understand Clausewitz's arguments, and even compares them to other military writers like Sun Tzu. Shortform covers books of every genre, including work, relationships, history, and society. Shortform is a great way to introduce yourself to new books and to brush up on ones you've already read. It even covers podcasts like Father Mike Schmidt's Bible in a Year. To start using Shortform today, click on my link in the description and you can get 5 days of unlimited access and an additional 20% discount on the annual subscription. That's 5 days of free access to test it out and a 20% discount by using my links for Shortform today. Special thanks again to Shortform for sponsoring this video. The two key premises I'll be showing in this video are: Number 1, American intervention was unjust and immoral and based mostly on false pretenses. And number 2, that by its intervention, the American government did more harm to the world and its own citizens than good. Let's go back to 1914 when the Great War officially began. On paper, the US was officially neutral. However, business and economic interests in the country heavily favored Britain. In economic terms, America was never neutral. Early into the war, American bankers sold thousands of tons of explosives and munitions to the Entente. The UK faced an armament shortage, but weapons supplied from America ended it. These actions did not reflect the attitude of the American public, who was much more divided on the war. U.S. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned his post in 1915 in protest of this flagrant violation of neutrality. Wall Street bankers also gave billions in loans to Britain and France, helping their finances to stay afloat and ensuring they could fund their war effort. Obviously, Germany did not take well to this. Imagine someone is shooting you with a machine gun and the person next to them is giving them new boxes of bullets to keep shooting at you. This is the situation Germany faced with Britain and America. But it goes even deeper. At the start of the war, Britain blockaded Germany, cutting American trade there by 99%. The blockade treated everything, even food for civilians, as contraband. Britain seized American vessels and stole American goods that tried to pass through the blockade. The blockade ended up killing over 500,000 German civilians over the course of the war. American firms that tried to trade with Germany were blacklisted by the British government. Despite this clear violation of America's neutrality, American bankers and politicians still gave Britain preferential treatment. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by Senator Robert La Follette, who said in a speech, "While Germany has again and again yielded to our protests, I do not recall a single instance in which a protest we have made to Great Britain has won for us the slightest consideration. By suspending the rule with respect to neutral rights in Great Britain's case, we have been actively aiding her in starving the civil population of Germany." In response to this blockade, Germany famously began its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare. The goal was to starve out the British before they could starve them out. Germany publicly declared the waters around Britain to be a war zone and warned all ships against sailing through them. Unfortunately for Germany, the American government would use this submarine warfare as reason for war. But considering that America was doing everything it could to ensure Germany lost the war, outside of directly sending troops, can one really blame Germany for this? To make matters even more hypocritical, the British government started stuffing passenger ships with weapons and ammunition and sending them directly through a war zone. The Lusitania was the most infamous example. It was carrying over 1,000 passengers, but also 170 tons of ammunition and explosives. The British government denied this fact all the way until 1982, when the truth finally came out. This shouldn't just be glossed over. The sinking of the Lusitania was a major incident that soured relations between the American government and Germany. But it turns out Germany was well within its rights to sink the ship. To put Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare in even more context, Britain had begun arming its merchant ships and ordering them to fly under false flags. In several cases, they would pretend to surrender to German subs and then break out the guns once they came close. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, gave orders to treat German submarine crews as pirates and to execute them on sight, an order which violated the Hague Convention of 1908. British merchant ships were even instructed to ram any German submarine they could. All of this meant that German U-boats had reason to shoot to kill rather than negotiate surrenders, even with ships flying neutral flags. To put it clearly, the British government used deception and war crimes to bait German attacks on American merchant ships. But while American public opinion turned against Germany because of their submarine warfare, Woodrow Wilson and Congress also had financial goals in mind with war. American bankers like J.P. Morgan wanted the mountains of money and resources they loaned to the Entente to be paid back. This gave the US government a financial incentive in an Entente victory. Not exactly a moral or clean reason for entering the massive war, but claiming you're defending yourself from supposed German aggression helps politicians sleep better at night. Speaking of Woodrow Wilson, he had a habit of saying one thing while doing the opposite. He ran on staying out of the war and calling for arms control, while at the same time doing all he could to build up America's military-industrial complex. The Naval Act of 1916, signed by Wilson, was meant to build a navy second to none by the 1920s. This was all while he ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." In Wilson's declaration of war against Germany, he declared that neutrality is no longer feasible or desirable with autocratic governments, and claimed the very existence of so-called autocrats threatened the existence of the democratic countries of the world. Wilson was thus perhaps the first president ever to represent the ideology that America should charge into war against every perceived non-democratic government in the world. Wilson entered the war with a messiah complex and embodied the worst aspects of American interventionism, past and present. Over 50 members of the House of Representatives voted against the war, including Majority Leader Claude Kitchin. He argued, "No invasion is threatened, not a foot of our territory is demanded or coveted. No essential honor is required to be sacrificed. No part of our sovereignty is questioned." Despite these facts, most congressmen still voted for war. While the US called the German Empire an autocracy, it objectively was not. It had an elected legislature, the Reichstag. The Kaiser did have more power over the legislative process than, say, the British King, but the Reichstag had an important role in writing laws and government budgets. This means the Kaiser did not wield absolute power, which is a prerequisite to be an autocracy. The German Empire had universal male suffrage, and German citizens enjoyed some of the most advanced social programs in the world at the time. The US loves to call every government it doesn't like a dictatorship in need of freedom. Some things never change. Another justification America used to attack Germany was that it was responsible for the war and a unique threat to world peace. American and British propaganda displayed Germany as an aggressive and expansionist power bent on world domination. Germans were portrayed as subhuman barbarians, killing babies and raping women. American war correspondents actually studying the events estimated that only 10% of the atrocity stories coming out of the British press were genuine. Nevertheless, these ideas would later make it into the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany was assigned full guilt for the war. But there was just one problem. Germany was not uniquely responsible for the war. When looking at the lead up to 1914, it's clear how the other European powers shared responsibility for the conflict. Prior to war breaking out, Germany was encircled on both sides by the hostile alliance of France and Russia. France, in particular, was looking for any excuse to attack Germany as revenge for its loss in the Franco-Prussian War 40 years earlier. In that war, France suffered an embarrassing defeat, and its territory of Alsace-Lorraine was annexed into Germany. After the war, a new French republic was created that was militantly anti-German. France wanted Alsace-Lorraine back and to regain its position as continental Europe's leading power. This ideology was known as revanchism, from the French word revanche, or revenge. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire and its ally Serbia were posing an existential threat to Austria-Hungary. The Austrian Empire had many Slavs in its domain who Serbia wanted to unite into their country, and Russia was ready to back Serbia up in doing so. When Austria declared war on Serbia in response to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Russia immediately mobilized its army of almost 2 million men. Germany told them to demobilize, but this was rejected. Germany then declared war on Russia and France, beginning the war. I bring this up not to demonize any one particular country. It's to show that Germany did not bear sole responsibility for the war, as the Treaty of Versailles, with US approval, said. Next, there was the UK. It was Britain that declared war on Germany, not the reverse. They already had the largest empire in the world at the time, spanning over 11 million square miles. The British government joined the war with the justification of defending neutral Belgium, but this was a questionable reason at best. Days before the war began, the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey wrote to the French ambassador that Belgian neutrality might be an important, but not decisive, factor in British action. The term "not decisive" is critical here. It was widely believed, then and now, that Britain would have joined the war to stop Germany regardless of whether Belgium was invaded or not. In truth, Belgian neutrality was simply the pretext. Britain's hostility to Germany came from seeing it as a rival who could replace them as the world's leading European power. In 1914, London was the capital of global finance, and international financiers wanted to eliminate Germany as a trade rival and take its overseas colonies. Germany was producing more iron and steel than Britain and had matched it in coal production. Since Napoleon, Britain had pursued a foreign policy of preventing any one European country from becoming a hegemon. Germany was in position to do that in 1914, so Britain attacked. This decision by the British government was purely voluntary, but despite this, they would be treated as a damsel in distress by the US. One truly disturbing aspect of American intervention that's usually overlooked is how its support of the Entente made the war much bigger and longer. Historical analysis has found that without the economic and military aid the US provided the Entente, the alliance could not have engaged in a successful war of attrition. Loans from the US kept the Entente in the fight and prolonged the war. This means that World War I may have ended years earlier if America had not been intervening on the side of Britain and France. Millions of lives could have been spared on all sides. We see here how American interventionism caused the deaths of millions of more Europeans. Everyone always says, Oh, World War I was so horrible and devastating. Well, it didn't have to be as horrible and as devastating if not for American intervention. What became known as the Great War could have just been a normal war. Astonishingly, despite fighting a 3 versus 5 war, the Central Powers still almost won. Russia was knocked out of the war in early 1918 and descended into a civil war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk created a German-dominated Eastern Europe. In France, soldiers were mutinying en masse and refusing to go on offensives. Italy had suffered devastating setbacks and been pushed back from the Austrian border. German troops were being shipped from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. American military intervention turned the tide of the war back in the Entente's favor. Time magazine goes as far as saying, "It must be baldly stated, Germany would have won World War I had the US Army not intervened." When America entered in 1917, German generals recognized they had no ability to counter 2 million or more troops set to arrive in the summer of 1918. This caused them to throw all of their remaining forces into a final offensive in northern France. General Erich Ludendorff told his fellow commanders, "We must strike before America can throw strong forces into the scale." But due to the extreme difficulty of offensives on the Western Front, the success of this desperate last push was not to be. With over 10,000 American troops arriving in France every day, the German Spring Offensive was stopped. At this point, the realization that they couldn't win the war swept across the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary collapsed as national independence movements sprang up, encouraged by President Wilson's promise to give all nations self-determination. The German imperial government was overthrown in November 1918, officially bringing the war to an end. This German revolution was partly caused by the Wilson administration refusing to recognize the German imperial government as legitimate for peace negotiations. This means that not only did American intervention cause Germany to lose the war, but it toppled and destabilized their entire system of government. The next step was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, dictated to Germany by the victorious powers, was not concerned with honesty, fairness, or hypocrisy. It was simply about extracting as much for the victorious powers as they could get away with. Many diplomats at the peace conference agreed. The famous British economist John Maynard Keynes stormed out of the conference and wrote in his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace, "Paris was a nightmare. A sense of impending catastrophe overhung the frivolous scene. Levity, blindness, insolence, all the elements of ancient tragedy were there." He described Woodrow Wilson as slow-minded and bewildered, who knew little of Europe. The leader of France, Georges Clemenceau, he called a giant ape, concerned only with revenge on Germany. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George he called preoccupied with bringing a deal home which would pass muster for a week. As for the treaty, the outcome speaks for itself. Rather than negotiate with the losers as had been done at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Allies imposed what Germans would come to call the Diktat. It stripped Germany of 10% of its population and territory. Its colonies were handed over to Britain. Britain was also given the Holy Land from the Ottoman Empire, which was promptly handed over to Zionists. The Balfour Declaration, made by the British government to Lord Rothschild, declared Palestine to be a national home for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration and its consequences still affect us to this very day. At the same time, the German economy was intentionally crippled. The victors took no measures to stabilize the broader European economy, and many people in the future, like President Herbert Hoover, blame this treaty for the Great Depression. To make matters even worse, the Treaty of Versailles nullified the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, paving the way for Russia to fall under the Bolsheviks and become the Soviet Union. The new League of Nations was full of contradictions from the beginning. It gave the right of self-determination to some nations, but not others. For example, the newly created state of Austria was forbidden from joining Germany. Moreover, Germany was expected to accept total defeat despite the fact that it agreed to the armistice of 1918 on the grounds of getting a fair peace. Even at the time, many leaders predicted the new post-war order wouldn't last, And as they predicted, the post-war peace broke down in just 20 years and resulted in a Second World War. Woodrow Wilson had once remarked that an unjust peace was sure to invite future calamities. He and other pro-war government officials invited calamities indeed. While America's intervention caused devastation abroad, Americans at home lost freedoms. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 effectively outlawed any criticism of the government or the war effort. Violating these laws could land someone up to 20 years in prison. Over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted, while untold numbers kept quiet to avoid the same fate. Newspapers that made even slight criticisms of the government's policy were banned. How dare any American have a problem with their country charging into an unnecessary and brutal war across the ocean for no good reason? Millions of Americans from different regions, political persuasions, and ethnic groups opposed US entry into the war, but they were all silenced. These kind of laws are understandable when a country is facing an existential threat like a full-scale invasion, but the US was facing neither. Germany and the Central Powers posed virtually no threat to the US homeland. These laws were simply used to crush dissent and centralize power. Perhaps what's most disturbing about this is that the Espionage Act is still law to this very day, and it's been used against journalists like Julian Assange who exposed crimes of the US government. While anti-war voices were squelched during World War I, pro-war voices were amplified. Executive Order 2594 established the Committee on Public Information, the first state bureau in US history dedicated solely to propaganda. The CPI used movies, rallies, newspapers, photographs, and really anything it could to saturate the public with pro-war and anti-German views. Senator Robert La Follette harshly criticized all of these laws, saying in a speech to the Senate, "The espionage bills, the conscription bills, and other forcible military measures which are being ground out of the war machine in this country is the complete proof that those responsible for this war fear that it has no popular support, and that the army sufficient to satisfy the demand of the Entente allies cannot be recruited by voluntary enlistments." Unfortunately, German Americans and their culture also came under attack. America was not some anti-German country before the war. In the years leading up to 1914, German was the second most common language in the US and an established part of the high school curriculum. German schools, food, and newspapers were common. But the war changed everything. Suddenly, German schools, societies, and newspapers were attacked and shut down in droves. 14 states banned German from being spoken in schools. Many German Americans stopped speaking their language and changed their names to avoid harassment. Woodrow Wilson infamously stoked the hysteria, saying, "Any man who carries a hyphen about him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic." This was a reference to how German names often contained hyphens. Over 6,000 German Americans were sent to internment camps. Yes, you heard that right, internment camps didn't start with Japanese people in World War II. These policies would have a long-lasting effect on the German community in America. But what happened with the American military? America's entry into the war marked the birth of the modern military-industrial complex. It completely changed America's military from how it had previously existed. In 1914, America had a volunteer army of just 130,000. But once America entered the war, conscription was introduced. Americans were now forced into service. The new National Army grew to over 4 million men, an increase of almost 3,000%. By 1918, it was flooding into Europe. At the same time, the income tax was dramatically increased to fund the new war machine. So, in short, due to America entering World War I, Americans became more censored, more taxed, and more propagandized. Meanwhile, 110,000 Americans lost their lives fighting abroad. The country had lived up to the fears of Robert E. Lee, who famously warned after the Civil War, "The consolidation of the states into one vast empire, sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, will be the certain precursor of ruin which has overwhelmed all that preceded it." In the end, because of American intervention, World War I was the beginning of the downfall of not only Germany, but of European civilization. The prolonged war had killed millions on all sides. I covered what happened to Germany, but they weren't the only nation in deep trouble. The Great Austrian Empire, which had lasted for 500 years, became a gaggle of small, squabbling states. Even the European victors didn't come out great. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Empire went from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor, owing most of that money to Wall Street and Washington. France owed similar massive amounts. With Germany paying them reparations, this meant that the wealth of all three countries was being sent to America. A new world war broke out just 20 years later, and this time Britain and France also lost their empires. Today, Britain especially is a skeleton of its former self, about to be economically surpassed by Poland. If Germany had simply been left alone by America in the Great War, they probably would have achieved hegemony on the European continent. But what problem is that to America? The US already had two entire continents, North and South America, under its influence. The idea that the American government should be the world police, marching around the globe and smashing any country that defies it, was born in 1917. After the war, many Americans did sober up to the reality of what their country's actions had caused. The vast majority of the public wanted to scale back the military and avoid more foreign interventions in Europe. But the damage had largely been done, and the US military would never return to the relatively small size it was in 1914. So, to recap, American intervention in World War I dragged out the war and made it much more devastating, caused a second and even worse war, destroyed Germany unjustly, and led to the downfall of European civilization. Today, we live in the wake of these problems. When taken in full, it's hard to see America's intervention in this war, economic and military, as anything other than an infamous crime. This video is especially relevant today as tensions around the world are rising and the US seems to be gearing up for yet another war abroad. Learning from this history and not lining up to be fodder for this empire in a third world war seems like a good idea. This has been Pax, and thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on all this. If you'd like to see more videos, please consider supporting the channel. Also, make sure to check out short form through the links provided below. As always, I will see you in the next video.